Please be seated. The title of my message this morning is The Trap of Religious Rigidity. Inspired from the verse, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. For a month now, we have listened to the encounters Jesus has had with different religious leaders in the temple. First, it was the chief priests and the elders. Then it was the Sadducees. Today, it is the Pharisees. So who are the Sadducees and Pharisees? In the first century, a number of religious sects existed. Some were radical, like the Essene. Others were obscure, like the Boethusians. The biggest and most powerful were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And after listening to this morning's reading, we could be forgiven if we think these two groups worked together and agreed with each other. But they didn't. The central areas of contention were surrounding something called the halakha, or the legal system based on the commandments from the Torah. The Sadducees' system was rigid, especially in interpreting what was or wasn't religiously pure. They also had strict rules regarding sacrifices. The Pharisees were considered to be more lenient. Not surprisingly, the Sadducees and the Pharisees hotly debated each other over their legal interpretations. For instance, one of the most famous and highly charged controversies between the Pharisees and the Sadducees was the question of where to burn incense on the Day of Atonement. The Sadducees also objected to the Pharisees' beating of the willows on the Sabbath, right? Their debates spilled over into criminal law as well. For example, the Sadducees held a literal interpretation of an eye for an eye, whereas the Pharisees were okay with monetary compensation. And while both groups served at the temple at the same time, they could vehemently disagree with each other. For instance, there's a story of the head Pharisee named David at the time went up to and spoke to the head Sadducee leader who was named Ben. He said, David turns to Ben and says, all of these religious rules are so rigid, you're making everyone so sad. You see? Well, Ben wasn't to be outdone. And he said, well, your leniency, you just want to make everything fair, you see. I worked a lot on that one. From then on, they were known as the Sadducees and the Pharisees. I tell you, these jokes are really good. I expect at least a 5 or 10% increase in your pledge. Such religious disagreements are not exclusive to the religious leaders of the first century. Even us Episcopalians have had our disputes through the years. One of our hot debates was the dispute between high church and low church, which came about in the 1800s. The characteristics of high church Episcopalians were several. First, they argued for an active bishop, a bishop who would travel out into the parishes, who would write letters to the parishes, and would be in and amongst the congregations. The apostolic succession exhibited by the laying on of hands on the priests at ordination, was crucial for those high church folks. They also had a dim view of clergy participation in interdenominational or political organizations. The first emphasized the difference that the Protestants had from the Episcopalians. Remember, in the 1800s, not so many Catholics around. So the Episcopalians wanted to say, no, we are different from, the high churchers said we want to be different from the other Protestant denominations, us Episcopalians. The political piece was, as you may know, during the American Revolution, some of the Episcopal clergy happened to be, how we say, a little bit more outspoken than others, and some wound up dead in a ditch. So, particularly if you're not familiar, one of your own past rectors. So, the high church folks said, enough, let's stay out of politics. They also emphasized the importance of the baptismal covenant. Low church view differed. It stressed the importance of adult renewal of faith. This comes down to them from the First Great Awakening that had preachers traveling throughout the countryside having people reaffirm their faith as adults. And the low church folks said, yeah, that's a good idea. And they wanted to bring that into the church. Low church, also de-emphasized the role of bishops. If you recall or may know that for about the first 100 years or so, the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church in the colonies at the time, never had a bishop set foot on the continent. None of the bishops would travel across the ocean to come and be in here in America, and because of which the churches got on just fine and said, you know what, these bishops, not so important. So low church view had a less important view of bishops. They also stressed the similarities with the Protestant denominations. They emphasized a simple liturgy, not for any other reason but that more time could be spent listening to the sermon. The sermon, however, could not be full of histrionics that would cause the people to become emotional, perhaps faint in the pews, or some sort of emotional outbursts. We're Episcopalians after all. They emphasized fervent prayer and Bible reading as well. The groups were so rigid in their beliefs that they established seminaries so that priests could be taught and following these different schools. So a group in D.C. were one of the camps of the low church, and they founded the Virginia Seminary in Alexandria. The other part of that group founded seminaries both in Philadelphia and at Harvard and Cambridge. The high church group founded seminaries at General and at Yale and at Nashotah House, which is in the upper Midwest. The only way that these two groups were able to overcome their differences is when a third group arose, and they were known as the Broad Church. They not surprisingly, took a little bit from the high church and a little bit from the low church that they liked and pulled that together and said, we believe in some of both, which began to deflate some of the stress that was building. And they also emphasized the intellectual inquiry. And so famously that they would say, we will seek the truth wherever it is found, cost what it may, this approach to this intellectual inquiry allowed for the sciences to be brought into the pulpit and brought into the teaching of the church. They also viewed at that time and emphasized the role of social action. And we have a bit of all of that in us. And a bit of all of that is at this church. As you can see, humans tend to focus on the details, and sometimes we follow them to extremes. We can become religiously rigid. When we do, we lose the sight of the greater good. The Pharisees and the Sadducees lost sight of God's active presence in the world. They focused on the details of the religious law and lost sight of the wondrous works of God working outside of the temple. And they could not see God at work in and through Jesus. We too can get caught up in these traps of religious rigidity, losing our sight on the greater good and focusing and losing our focus on Jesus. The high church versus low church raised important issues, but they went too far. When we begin thinking that we know what is right around worship, we have fallen into the trap of religious rigidity. Whenever we start to think that the way we do things is better or more privileged and more preferred by God, the trap is closing in on us. The cost is great. When we're religiously rigid, we lose our ability to see God at work around us. God works in surprising ways. God delights in bringing about new ways to relate to Him. This lesson is essential for another reason. In a few months, you will welcome a new rector. Under his or her leadership, the way you do things may change. Your reaction might be to say, we don't do those things here, or that's not our way, or we have always done it this way. Remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the low church and the high church, folks. Remember our tendency to become rigid. Keep an open heart and mind. Look for the new ways God is at work at Christ's church. Seek out the wondrous works of God.